Kalispera σας και καλώς ορίσατε. Bonsoir, bienvenue, good evening and welcome. I'm Jonathan Tomlinson, the Assistant Director of the Institute, and I have the pleasure of welcoming tonight's speaker, Vasilis, or Bill Molos. Bill holds a BA in History from the University of Toronto, an MA also in History from York University, and a PhD in European History from New York University, with a thesis entitled Nationness in the Absence of a Nation, the Prehistory of the Greek National Movement, 1762 to 1792. Bill then taught for a number of years at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and is currently the Director and Research Lead at the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Greek Canadian Archives at York University. He's also the co-host of HHF Presents Εδώ Polytechnio, a podcast series on the Athens Polytechnic Uprising of 1973, which is very good, actually. Bill has written on a range of topics, including anti-Ottoman resistance, the Greek Enlightenment, and Ontario's Hellenic Heritage Month. His book manuscript, The Russian Mediterranean, Shaping Sovereignty and Selfhood on the Island of Paros, 1768 to 1789, is under contract with Edinburgh University Press and will be published next year. This evening, he will give a lecture entitled Μην ψηφίσεις τον Έλληνα, Diaspora Politics in Greek Toronto. Bill.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jonathan. It's great to be here again at the Canadian Institute in Greece. I spent a lot of time here as a PhD candidate, and it's been great to see this new facility. I'm really excited to see it come to fruition. Several of you will know me as an 18th century historian, but over the past year and a half, I've embraced a new field, Greek Canadian history. I'm still a relative newcomer, but my participation in the Greeks in Canada, a digital public history research project, has provoked some new thoughts on diaspora politics that I'm presenting here for the first time, so I'll be very keen to receive some feedback. One note before I begin, I refer to John Cannis as broker model throughout this paper. I want to be clear that I'm not using the term in any way that may suggest impropriety. I'm using the term in the sense Maria Kimova deploys it in her book Diaspora Entrepreneurs in Contested States to signal the strength and depth of Cannis's linkages in Canada, Greece, and globally. I shall also note that in my conversations with John Cannis, he's expressed that he does not like the characterization of broker and would rather prefer to be considered an advocate or a facilitator. By 2019, the enthusiasm that carried Justin Trudeau into power had waned. The Liberal Party of Canada, LPC, won that year's federal election, but lost the popular vote by a wide margin. Bruised but resilient, they retained 157 seats in the House of Commons. Among these was Scarborough Centre, where Salma Zahid's convincing re-election left scars. Former Member of Parliament John Cannis revisited this election in two wide-ranging interviews on March 23rd and April 5th, 2023, for the Greeks in Canada, a digital public history research project. Many Greek Canadians undoubtedly recognize Cannis, a stalwart community advocate. Cannis served as Scarborough Centre's MP from 1993 to 2011, before leaving politics. In 2019, he was inspired to return, motivated to address perceived problems in his riding and add a fiscally responsible voice to Parliament. Frustrations with the LPC led him to run as an independent candidate. Along with Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, he belonged to a disgruntled group of former Liberal MPs who left or were expelled from the party during Justin Trudeau's first term. Cannis submitted nomination papers, anticipating support from the local Greek community. It never came. Quote, I was headed for victory, Cannis explained, but I had Greek people working behind my back. Aggrieved, candid, and prepared to show receipts, the former Parliamentary Secretary for Industry Canada recounted his memories of Election Day. He described how his son, a scrutineer at the polling station in his building, observed a woman whispering to her husband, quote, Μην ψηφίσεις τον Έλληνα. Visibly embittered, Cannis added that his daughter observed irregularities at a second polling station at the Hellenic Home for the Aged. Curtly, he surmised, Οι Ελληνίδες βάζανε τις γριούλες να ψηφίζουν για τη μουσουλμάνα. Some accusations were more specific. Cannis described a former friend who campaigned against him. If she's a strong liberal, let her campaign in her riding. Why come to Scarborough Centre? In his narration, personal betrayals and inadequate community support turned the election. The Greek community of Metropolitan Toronto Incorporated, the GCT, allowing all candidates to display their signs outside the St. John the Baptist Greek Orthodox Church in Scarborough was especially vexing for Cannis. Historically, GCT leadership permitted him alone to display campaign signs outside the church. Despite political affiliation or ideological differences, the GCT supported the Greek candidate. When Cannis asked for clarification about this change, he was rebuffed. He recalls someone from the GCT saying, "Πρέπει να είμαστε αντικειμενικοί." The community refused to favor any candidate in the riding. For Cannis, this shift carried enormous symbolic weight. Quote, "These 2 to 3 signs aren't the difference between a win or a loss. They simply send a message that the community is united," end quote. While stories of discord may interest some, Cannis' reflections raise a more compelling question. What model of diaspora politics should Greek Canadians practice? Cannis argues that access, direct political participation, is essential for effective diaspora mobilization. In short, Canadian ethnocultural communities require politicians from their communities to act as brokers, to access public funding and sway Canadian foreign policy in favor of their homelands. The envisioned community-broker relationship is reciprocal and symbiotic. The community collectively endorses the broker to speak on its behalf through gestures of public support, i.e. promoting the candidate, canvassing, and fundraising. In return, the broker acts as a knowledgeable spokesperson and advocate. They raise awareness among politicians and diplomats about issues affecting their community and homeland, secure funds for community projects, and influence foreign policy decisions, albeit never compromising their role as a Canadian MP or violating their Canadian oath of allegiance. An effective broker maintains close ties with their community and homeland. They understand the functioning of the Canadian political system, which levers to pull and when and with whom to make accommodations and alliances. Community leaders engage civil society channels in lockstep with the broker. They coordinate outreach to inform the Canadian mainstream about issues of concern and, quote, let them know who we are. Cannis presents his tenure in office as an example of a steadfast community broker relationship benefiting Greek Canadians. While he was an MP, Cannis secured federal funding for the Greek community of Toronto, the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church, the Taste of the Danforth Festival, and the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary Greek Orthodox Cathedral to support its restoration after a fire in the year 2000. More importantly, he served as a bulwark for Greece and Greeks. Cannis helped inform the Canadian position of neutrality on the Macedonian naming dispute in the early to mid-1990s. He kept his colleagues informed and accountable in 1994, insisting they refer to the then former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia by the name, quote, approved by the United Nations and agreed upon by both parties, end quote. When the Harper government decided to recognize the country by its constitutional name in 2007, Cannis condemned the Prime Minister for his, quote, clandestine and behind closed-door decision-making style, end quote. In this notable statement, Cannis criticized the Prime Minister for what he regarded as contempt for due process and democracy. Cannis similarly took a front seat during the 1996 EMEA crisis, when Turkey claimed the 2 uninhabited islets of EMEA. For Cannis, Canada could not stay silent, given parallels with its ongoing dispute over Hans Island. Quote, Canada had a vested interest to reaffirm what the treaties had already confirmed, end quote. During a trip to Kalymnos, he chartered a boat alongside Greek colleagues to the international waters around EMEA. As they approached, Cannis raised the Canadian flag to signal Canada's investment in the issue. Liberal colleague Ted Bukwini, a member for Vancouver Quadra, went a step further, declaring that, quote, Greece's sovereignty and territorial title over the Dodekanesia Islands, including EMEA, are clear and unquestioned in international law, end quote. Alongside this advocacy, Cannis spotlights 3 other notable successes. In 2003, he moved Motion 318 to return the Parthenon marbles to Greece. 7 years later, under a conservative government no less, he marshaled unanimous support for his motion to reopen the Christian Orthodox Theological Institute in Halki in Turkey. Yet, Cannis is particularly proud of his efforts to resolve the Cyprus issue. His advocacy is evident in statements denouncing the invasion on behalf of 200,000 refugees, endorsing the NATO mission in Kosovo, supporting a UN-led resolution in Iraq before the 2003 US invasion, and in debates on the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement implementation. For Cannis, normative statements are essential but insufficient to facilitate change. Education and sustained discussion are needed to galvanize support for impactful policy responses. Guided by this view, Cannis worked with Cypriot friends Dinos Sophocleos and Kosti Hadzikosti to organize a large reception on Parliament Hill soon after his election. The aim was to introduce politicians and the diplomatic corps to Cypriot culture and community leaders from Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. By all accounts, this was a success that spurred further conversation on the issue. In 1994, Cannis partnered with other MPs to establish the Canada-Cyprus Friendship Group as a venue to ensure Canada's continued engagement. The group determined that MPs had to witness life on the divided island for themselves, so Cannis helped organize a visit in 1995. Eleni Bakopanos, the member for Saint Denis and the first Greek-born woman elected to Parliament, participated and shared some revealing comments upon her return. For years I had read and spoken about the Cyprus issue. However, I could never have imagined feeling the way I did that day as I looked on to the ghost town of Famagusta, occupied by Turkish troops since the invasion of the island in 1974. It is my hope that I can return to Cyprus one day and see a reunited Cyprus and visit Famagusta and Kyrenia, admire the view from the Pedachtila Mountains, and taste the fresh oranges from the orange groves of Morphou." End quote. The following year, Bakopanos introduced a motion to promote the demilitarization of Cyprus, which Cannis supported. Sustained discussion of the Cyprus issue continued in the House for years. In 1999, Karen Redmond, member for Kitchener's Centre and sitting chair of the Canada-Cyprus Friendship Group, stood to recognize the 25th anniversary of the island's division. She affirmed the importance, quote, "for all members of this House to be aware of the political problems that Cypriots face each and every day," end quote. However, the group's most significant achievement was the establishment of the High Commission of Cyprus in Canada, which has bolstered diplomatic, economic, cultural, and social ties between the two countries. Cannis's work in committees and the House was laudable, but his efforts extended beyond the Hill. He worked with the Canadian Justice for Cyprus Committee, PSECA Canada, to engage American counterparts in conversation over the Cyprus dispute. Cannis met with Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman Michael Bilarakis to discuss recommendations for resolution. Locally, he regularly connected with Greek and Cypriot organizations. On May 16, 2002, he invited their leaders to his Scarborough office to meet Canada's Foreign Minister, Bill Graham. The presidents of the GCT, the Cypriot Community of Toronto Incorporated, PSECA Canada, the Hellenic Canadian Congress, and the Hellenic Canadian Diaspora were all in attendance. Together, they discussed the Cyprus issue, the Pontian genocide, the Macedonian naming dispute, EMEA, and Chalki. As MP and community broker, Cannis was a linchpin connecting the Canadian government with the Greek Canadian and Cypriot Canadian communities. He offered a voice to his community and kept the government abreast of developments in Greece and among Greek and Cypriot communities. Reflecting upon his nearly 2 decades in office, Cannis expresses pride over this advocacy and leadership. Ποιος έτρεξε για την Ελλάδα? Ποιος έτρεξε να μιλήσει για τους Πόντιους, για τους Κυπραίους, ή τα Ήμια, ή τα Σκόπια? Ποιος έφερε τα χρήματα στο Greek Community Center του Τορόντο? Το πρώτο εκατομμύριο είναι thanks to John Cannis. Ποιος έφερε το μισό εκατομμύριο για το Community Center του Αγίου Νικολάου? Ο John Cannis. Cannis's diaspora politics emerged out of a frustration with the Greek Canadian community that remained far too insular. When it came to the Cypriot occupation, quote, "we were discussing it in local newspapers. It just needed to go beyond that," end quote. Cannis felt Greek Canadians needed better representation within Canada's putatively representative institutions. He reached his boiling point while listening to dignitaries' remarks at the Greek Independence Day parade on the Danforth in 1992. I felt I was being patronized in the way the politicians were expressing themselves, what they were saying, how they were saying it, he continues. I concluded it wasn't really from their knowledge. It really wasn't from their hearts. It wasn't really because they knew what the War of Independence was in 1821, end quote. To Cannis, they appeared disinterested in the community, its history, and its priorities. This indifference was not limited to politicians in attendance. It was pervasive. Quote, They didn't know what the Cyprus issue was all about. They didn't know where Pontos was, never mind the Pontian genocide. They didn't have a clue what went on in Greece, end quote. They were performing pluralism, signaling respect for diversity without any meaningful engagement. Quote, I don't just want the city councillor or the MPP or the MP coming here once a year to tell me Kalimera or Kalispera and Oaksy Day, end quote. The feeling that this tepid pluralism was not benefiting Greek Canadians had grown intolerable. That day, Cannis decided to seek the Liberal nomination in his riding. He won the nomination on March 7, 1993, and was elected in October. Consistent in Cannis' narration is the sentiment that his 1993 election was a community victory. Quote, I felt our voice needed to be heard, he exclaims. Quote, prior to my election, some of the issues that were important to our broader community were not being heard. They were not even being discussed. And I realized, as a Greek Canadian growing up, we really didn't have a voice in there. We really didn't have an opportunity to tell our story and bring certain facts, end quote. Cannis' victory enabled him to develop and execute a strategy to address these issues. His presence in the House kept Greek Canadian issues, quote, front and center on a continuous basis, end quote. From within the government, he educated and informed colleagues through speeches, events, and committees. He formed informal platforms for Canadian and American politicians keen to support Greece and Cyprus. He established effective communication channels between the Greek and Cypriot community organizations and cabinet members. Through trade missions, he liaised with Canadian businesses, banks, and universities interested in nurturing closer ties with Greece, notably TVX Gold, Spar Aerospace, Turtle Island, Orlicon Technologies, Sunlight Juice, Ice One Producers, and York University. He permitted Canada to exert influence as a mediator, assisting the Canadian delegation's work with the marginalized Muslim minority in Thrakis, Xanthi, and Komotini regions. For Cannis, he created a model for how a Greek Canadian politician can support their community and advocate for Greece as a Canadian politician. On this latter point, Cannis is clear about his cascading priorities and loyalties. Quote, my top priority was looking after my country, the issues of Canada, the issues of my province, and the issues of my riding, end quote. The Greek Canadian community rebuked Cannis' model of diaspora politics from the 2019 election forward. The GCT's commitment to, quote, objectivity was echoed by Greek Canadian MPs who have been reluctant to serve as brokers. Commenting on the sea change, Cannis notes, quote, today, for example, we have politicians in Parliament who can't stand up and take positions. Somebody says to me, I don't want to be depicted as a Greek politician. Who says the Greek politician? You're a Canadian politician. We take on geopolitical issues. Then why are you talking about Ukraine? Why are you talking about Kosovo? Why are you talking about South America? Why are you talking about China? End quote. From Cannis' perspective, the GCT and Greek Canadian MPs have misunderstood Canadian pluralism. Pluralism as an ethic, respect for human diversity, and a commitment to balancing competing values is one thing. Pluralism as practice, a set of institutional mechanisms governments employ to determine what projects they prioritize, is another. It was misguided to expect a Big Ten party, in this case the Liberal Party of Canada, to consistently represent a single cultural community's interest without a community broker to advocate. These organizations comprise diverse coalitions representing various views and interests. Moreover, it was self-sabotaging not to realize that large-scale community projects typically require public funding and that allocating such funds is akin to a zero-sum game among communities. In recent years, the Tamil, Armenian, and Chinese communities have received ample funding, between 4.2 and 35.9 million, from the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program and the Ontario Trillium Benefit to build community centres. While they may take exception with this characterization, it appears that an MP or a member of provincial parliament, an MPP, acted as a broker in each case. Gary Anandasangri, MP for Scarborough Rouge Park, Adis Babikian, MPP for Scarborough Agincourt, Sean Chen, MP for Scarborough North, and Raymond Cho, MPP for Scarborough North. Having observed these developments, Cannis derides his community's failure to secure similar funds. Quote, δεν ξέρανε πώς να κάνουν access στο σύστημα. Δεν ξέρουν τι μπορούν και πώς να μπορούν να εκμεταλλευτούν τα χρήματά τους, διότι είναι χρήματα τα δικά τους. End quote. By failing to support his campaign and by extension, failing to endorse a broker, Greek Canadians effectively suppress their voices. Quote, "Who's going to speak for us?" Cannis asks rhetorically. Quote, "I think we're losing the game," end quote. He adds, stressing his frustration has little to do with his personal defeat. The election loss was a collective failure. Politics for Cannis is about compromise and concession within spaces where such negotiations yield impact. By not supporting a Greek candidate, the community shot itself in the foot before the race even began. Rallying behind the incumbent Liberal MP, Salma Zahid, was a strategic failure and inconsistent with what other communities were doing. Quote, "We have to be open. Are they open? I went to the mosque, which I helped them raise $1.5 million for the mosque we built. Do you know what they said? No. They supported theirs. And you know what they did? They congregated and consolidated and got a victory," end quote. The pre-election endorsement of Salma Zahid negated the possibility of post-election access to a candidate who had supported the community so well in the past. For Cannis, Greeks must support Greeks regardless of political affiliation. He points to Metropolitan Archbishop Sotirios as a community leader who unreservedly supports Greek candidates. He also notes his personal support for Nick Mantas and Efi Triantafylopoulos, regardless of their political affiliation. We belong to a small community of 260,000 or so. We are neither Indigenous, nor do we belong to one of Canada's two founding peoples. To contribute to Canadian politics meaningfully and in a way that reflects our shared commitments, we must promote Greek candidates within ridings where Greek Canadians are densely concentrated, ridings like Scarborough Centre. In making this point, Cannis did not raise the possibility that such a stance may undermine our democracy. Indeed, why would he? Diasporic people spend their lives navigating complex and occasionally competing obligations to their society and their homeland. As Canadians, we understand our duties to other members of our shared society. Similarly, as Greeks, we feel a burden to sustain our connections to our heritage, traditions, and history. Each self-identifying Greek Canadian will likely interpret and weigh these obligations differently. Few will deny them. Our civic commitments and ethnicity coexist. They are neither incompatible nor oppositional. But Cannis's comments stress that our duties are situational. For the Greek Canadian community to thrive, ethnicity must trump party affiliation and policy preferences in the pre-election contest. As Greek Canadians, we share enough ideas, values, and projects to unite us in coalition. Community members need not share every idea to endorse potential brokers. Community projects will not advance without this support, and Greek Canadians will lack adequate tools for swaying Canadian foreign policy. Cannis goes further, arguing that our failures since 29 are more than a strategic misstep. They are betrayals of Hellenism. Σήμερα δεν έχουμε μια φωνή στη Βουλή. Γιατί? Γιατί πήγαμε όχι μόνο να υποστηρίξουμε έναν Έλληνα, αλλά πήγαμε στα ανοιχτά και εναντίον του. Και αυτοί οι άνθρωποι πρέπει να ντρέπονται και πρέπει να έχουν τίποτα να κάνουν με τον ελληνισμό, διότι προδώσανε τον ελληνισμό από όλες τις απόψεις. End quote. Betrayals aside, much of what Cannis has said appears sensible. I suspect most Greek Canadians agree that promoting Greek language, culture, and history in Canada is desirable. I also suspect many would want to secure Canada's staunch support for Greece's territorial integrity. Organizing and lobbying for related policies or garnering support for these ends seems reasonable and necessary. Yet, Greek Canada, like all diasporic spaces, is heterogeneous and fragmented. It is a shifting constellation of varied sites with varying degrees of connection. It comprises individuals advancing diverse claims for their community and homeland, and each weighs the need for cultural promotion and homeland activism differently against others, for instance, the need to sustain national unity. Indeed, we live in one of the most diverse democracies in the world. Nurturing the bonds that unite us as a society requires continuously affirming what we share as Canadians. Preserving Canada's national fabric compels us to make choices about who we were as a way of knowing who we are and what we aspire to be. Yet, as Will Kimlicka notes, quote, this link between nationhood and liberal democracy creates endemic risks for all those who are not seen as belonging to the nation, including Indigenous peoples, substrate national groups, and immigrants. since they are not seen as members of the nation or people in whose name the state governs, and may indeed be seen as potentially disloyal fifth columns, they are often not trusted to govern themselves or to share in the governing of the larger society." End quote. An effective model of diaspora politics must acknowledge that cultural promotion and homeland activism do not occur within a neutral backdrop. Then NDP leader Thomas Mulcair reminded Cannis of this during a 2010 debate on the Tax Convention's Implementation Act. After Mulcair expressed his, quote, "fierce opposition," end quote, to signing a trade deal with Colombia, he noted that Canada should not sign free trade agreements with parties that do not, quote, "respect our basic values, such as the respect for human rights," end quote. Given that the act would not only apply to Colombia, but to Greece and Turkey as well, Cannis rose to ask Mulcair why he had no reservations about signing a treaty with Turkey, given that, quote, "1/3 of Cyprus is illegally occupied by Turkish forces," end quote. Rather than explain why human rights abuses perpetrated by one country were more palatable, Mulcair impugned Cannis for a perceived lack of objectivity. Unfortunately, the belligerent words he has just spoken, affirming in the House that 1/3 is illegally occupied, shows that he is incapable of understanding that in these historical questions, there are always two sides in a story, end quote. After Cannis repeated his question, Mulcair went further, suggesting the impropriety of an MP engaging in homeland activism by invoking the memory of Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Quote, "Madam Speaker, one of the more interesting lessons from Canadian history involves Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who was being pushed to take a side with Athenians. He stood up and said that when we arrived in this country, we would assert our values and do the best we could to share those values with the rest of the world," end quote. Mulcair continued, asserting that Cannis was, quote, "incapable of any perspective," end quote, and portraying the Cyprus issue as practically resolved. Quote, "I'm so proud to be a Canadian. I'm so proud that we have used our expertise and experience on the world stage to help in a place as troubled as Cyprus. I am also very pleased as a citizen of the world that Cyprus now knows peace," end quote. John Cannis' reply merits an extended quote. "I was saddened when he talked about not bringing our ways here. I too am proud of the Canadian record on peacekeeping. I was saddened when he said that, to quote him, he said he was a proud Canadian. I do not know what he was referring to, but I do not know what it is going to take. Is it going to take my grandfather, John Cannis, who arrived on these shores 105 years ago? Is it going to take my 3 grandchildren's generation before I belong or anybody else?" I asked the member to reflect on his words. "I proudly say that I am of the race of Solon. I am of the race of Pericles, Socrates, Hippocrates, Alexander the Great of Macedonia in Greece, but I am also the product of Sir John A. Macdonald, Cartier, Laurier, Pearson, and Trudeau. That is why I have the privilege of standing in this honorable house," end quote. At the time of this exchange, the Cannis family's connections with Canada was over a century old, and John Cannis had devoted nearly 2 decades to public service. Yet, when he raised a legitimate question, the leader of a federal party questioned his objectivity and loyalty. At that moment, the limits of his broker model came into focus. To be clear, Cannis' model has virtues and limitations. For one, it ensures Greek Canadians have a voice in a meaningful public venue. Yet an MP's voice carries much more weight when they belong to a party with a majority in the House. Moreover, this style of diaspora politics has recently fallen out of favor. Cannis' exchange with Mulcair was not an isolated incident, but reflected a broader tension within Canadian culture. Since the publication of J.L. Granatstein's Who Killed Canadian History in 1998, if not earlier, disputes among Canadian historians have spilled into the public consciousness. For Granatstein, Canadians have been contending with a cultural challenge. Quote, "Unthinking Canadians complacently assumed that our schools and our society had turned immigrants all into good, bland, peace-loving Canadians. But a combination of federal multiculturalism, ignorance of the values of, and lack of understanding of their new homeland, and the practices of progressive education have prevented immigrants from becoming what they ought to have become, Canadians," end quote. Granatstein's stinging indictment of social history, history curricula, and multiculturalism has shaped a strand of Canadian conservative thought that increasingly pays lip service to diversity and pluralism. These arguments helped inform the Conservative Party of Canada's retreat from multiculturalism and their promotion of a, quote, new conception of Canadian nationhood, end quote, since 2010. In place of a national story about peacekeeping, Medicare, multicultural and bilingual policies, and the Charter, Conservatives have introduced a competing narrative centered on militarism and nostalgia for traditional British institutions and monarchy. With challenges from the left and right, it is hard to imagine a lone broker wielding much influence, especially if they must operate under a minority government. That is not to say the model is entirely unsuited to this new terrain. The success of the Tamil, Armenian, and Chinese communities suggests the opposite. Instead, I argue that effective diasporan advocacy and coordinated investment need not overwhelmingly depend on public funding. For instance, the Estonian and Jewish communities have relied on existing organizations and diaspora-directed capital campaigns. The $41 million Keskus International Estonian Center project resulted from a partnership between the Estonian House, Estonian Credit Union, Estonian Foundation of Canada, and Tartu College. The center's funding was secured through private donations from global donors, the sale of properties, and $750,000 from the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario. Similarly, the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center's $14 million renovation was primarily supported by a $5 million donation from the United Jewish Appeal, UGA, Federation of Greater Toronto, and a $2.5 million donation from the center's namesake. The renovation also received $870,000 from the City of Toronto, a portion of $15 million from the provincial government, and $420,000 to cover accessibility upgrades through the Department of Canadian Heritage's Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, Ontario Trillium Fund, and the City of Toronto. In both cases, government funding supported the project, but was not critical. Coordinated investment toward community projects requires effective mobilization. UGA boasts on its website that its annual fundraising campaign raises in excess of $60 million. By comparison, the GCT has struggled to coordinate, mobilize, and fundraise for years. Despite securing $3 million in federal and provincial funding and spending $12 million on construction, it failed to build the 80,000 square foot Hellenic Cultural Centre in Scarborough. The GCT had to sell properties to service its debt. During these years, the organization appeared mired in controversy. Accusations of corruption were common, leading the GCT and its then president, Kostas Menegakis, to launch a successful libel claim against the editor of the first Greek-Canadian press. Frictions with the Metropolitan produced another lawsuit and much public embarrassment in 2017. As tensions have eased in recent years and the GCT's $15 million debt has become more manageable, what has become clear is that the GCT's failure to build a cultural center had less to do with corruption than it did with the inability to coordinate and mobilize effectively. GCT President Betty Skoutaki recently shed light on this in an interview with Bill Vasilis of Greca TV, noting the lack of support for the center project. In addition to the government funds, the Hellenic Heritage Foundation donated $700,000. Meanwhile, the rest of the community only raised $700,000. To quote President Skoutaki, «Δεν υπήρχε περίπτωση να γίνει αυτό το έργο, γιατί δεν ανταποκρίθηκε η παροικία». Such ineffective mobilization reflects the community's generational divide, an observation made by Angelo Lascaris. The GCT and many other institutions are still led by individuals who arrived in the 1960s and 1970s during the second wave of Greek migration to Canada. This generation continually expresses worry that the community will wither once they pass. In thinking diaspora, they are stuck in antiquated models that assume inevitable acculturation without Greek language learning and Orthodox Christian ritual. Accordingly, the projects they pursue and the idioms they employ reflect a preservationist logic. Invest in youth language instruction in churches and recruit more GCT members to facilitate better advocacy. While many Greek Canadians share their commitments, this advocacy fails to engage most of us because it does not reflect our lived reality, particularly those of us born in Canada. An oft-cited Stuart Hall remark bears repeating. Quote, "The diaspora experience is defined not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity." End quote. Greek Canadians are not a monolith, nor are their politics self-evident. Many support and celebrate the Prespa Agreement and Greece's efforts to integrate its Western Balkan neighbors into the European Union. Many are irreligious and unmoved by calls to preserve the patriarchal school. I would wager that only a minority is reasonably informed on Cypriot history or the Parthenon marbles debate, and many do not care. As one Greek Canadian friend recently commented, "Who gives a shit about the Greek elections anyway?" End quote. I say this not to diminish John Cannis or the GCT, but to argue that any model of diaspora politics will fail to mobilize energies if it assumes that Greek Canadians are a uniform community needing better leadership. We are far from, quote, urban villagers, end quote, endeavoring to reproduce a static model of an idealized Greece. Each of us has a different and typically vacillating relationship with our Greekness. Certainly, many of us feel more Greek preparing particular foods, those associated with holidays and rituals, menomakarona, vasilopita, and our red eggs, or when participating in tsugrisma, parading, or rites of passage ceremonies. Yet Greek Canadians' cultural expression encompasses far more. Second-wave migrants may fear the loss of their community, but Greek Canadian culture is thriving. Hundreds of diverse organizations are presently active across the country. Playwrights are producing novel and transgressive cultural works, like Eliseos Kyrillou's Epaggelma Porni, a theatrical adaptation of Lili Zographou's novel. Greek film festivals are collaborating with the Jewish Women's Club of Toronto, Taste of the Middle East, and Omni Television to promote films about our shared experiences. Bands like Opa Yala are adapting Greek music, weaving it into Arabic and Persian songs. Community leaders are contributing to a long overdue conversation on reconciliation through the Crying Rock Initiative at Algoma University and other endeavors. Volunteers are mounting historical walking tours, creating podcasts, contributing to school curricula, and erecting historical plaques, often collaborating with city agencies, archives, school boards, politicians, and diplomats. In no way is this list exhaustive, but it is revealing of Greek Canada's vitality. Diasporas are alive, full of syncretisms and hybridities. They draw us in, moving us to express our beliefs, contribute to our community's development, foster a sense of belonging, or influence change. They are ever in process, but persistently there. Greek Canada must be interpreted accordingly. It is more than a frozen repository of idioms, rituals, and practices. Greek Canada is the reverberation of these many varied activities, is a structural effect produced through these voluntary engagements. Any viable model of diaspora politics must recognize the diversity of Greek Canadian subjectivities expressed within this diaspora space. It must also heed Kwame Appiah's warning against aggressive efforts at cultural preservation. Quote, "If we want to preserve a wide range of human conditions because it allows free people the best chance to make their own lives, there is no place for the enforcement of diversity by trapping people within a kind of difference they long to escape. There simply is no decent way to sustain those communities of difference that will not survive without the free allegiance of their members," end quote. A viable model will listen more than it speaks, acknowledging that the community's needs, desires, and purposes are articulated within its vibrant nodes. It will distill the symphony of voices into specific claims around which it forges coalitions and nurtures alliances. Ultimately, any effective model of diaspora politics must leverage existing infrastructure within civil society as a platform to pursue specific goals. While needs emerge locally, national forums like the Toronto Economic Forum serve as venues to introduce proposals to an international audience, build diverse coalitions, and develop strategies for policy development, advocacy, and lobbying. A voice in the House is nice, but organizations like the Hellenic Initiative Canada, the Canada Greek Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Hellenic Congress, and the Hellenic Canadian Board of Trade have a national mandate with long-standing relationships with sympathetic allies in the Canadian and Greek governments. Coordinating with and through them is essential. And here I need to pause. In preparing this text, I thought it was important to share this draft with John Cannis. He has shared feedback that I think merits some discussion and merits sharing. Among other things, he noted his support for the aforementioned organization, but also noted the following, and I quote, "To simply just state this approach for the purpose of feeling good has no merit or value. Having said that, I have yet to hear of or see any tangible policy initiatives that have or would influence governments, both in Canada and Greece. I ask when and how often do these organizations meet the Prime Minister, the Premier, MPs or MPPs, mayors or city councillors to present their policy statements and proposals? When have they lobbied these elected decision makers to address these issues that affect our broader community? Issues such as the new visa requirement for Canadians to travel to Greece, seniors' benefits for those that wish to return to Greece and other parts of the world. I have not heard of any lobbying for financial infrastructure support for the expansion to our 2 seniors' homes. It is a fact that in order to get results, the elected representatives at all levels must continuously be briefed while developing relationships. I would venture to say that from past experiences, such lobbying had occurred. Unfortunately, it was neither nurtured nor sustained properly. Allow me to use as an example the recent financial problems with the GCT and the sale of the community centre. From my experience in government, I can assure you that if the 3 levels of government had been properly approached for financial support, not only the governments would have responded favorably, but also the banking institutions would have participated with their share of support. I make these statements without any ambiguity because I experienced the same situation in the mid-1990s with the Greek community of Montreal. The federal government at that time was approached, they stepped in, and financially solved the problem. The model was there. A precedent had been set. Unfortunately, the leadership of the GCT at the time were asleep at the switch." End quote. Cannis also suggested that Greek Canadians need to learn from the Canadian Muslim Vote, an organization of prominent Muslim Canadian professionals. He notes that this organization's, quote, "mandate is to support Muslim candidates, mobilize as required, to raise funds, to volunteer, to get out the vote and elect a candidate from their community, irrespective of party affiliation," end quote. Cannis suggests that while he does not favor such tactics, Greek Canadians will struggle to influence policy if we continue to, quote, "procrastinate in establishing such mechanisms." Despite Cannis's frustration with the 2019 election, he remains optimistic. He celebrates the successes of young Greek Canadians and hopes to see the community thriving in harmony. Quote, "Έχουμε σχέσεις της ελληνικής παροικίας as a whole, να βρούνε μια ηρεμία, μια συνεννόηση, μια κατανόηση." End quote. I share his optimism and hopes. Since I assumed my current role, the community support for our project has heartened me. The engagement at a recent event commemorating the Athens Polytechnic uprising was particularly inspiring. Community leaders, dignitaries, and media were present. Students listened attentively to older generations recount their memories of the junta period, and all rejoiced at Hijaz's performance of anti-junta anthems. This was a special moment, bereft of acrimony and full of optimism. To me, it suggested that our community has entered a new era. While past wounds may never fully heal, and generational and ideological tensions will persist, Greek Canadians appeared poised to embark along a promising and collaborative road together. Please permit me to show a brief clip of this performance. Okay, unfortunately, I don't think it's available through QuickTime, so thank you, Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. If you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand so I can get the microphone to you.
Hi, Bill. Hello, Bill. My voice is not coming out. There's a bit of context missing. This is an amazing presentation and an amazing point you make about the broker model and how it serves communities. But the specific context that's been sort of nagging at me to the point where I pulled out my phone and I was trying to Google it is, why was Cannis expelled in the first place? Like, what's the background to this? Because might we be anchoring this entire conversation on an individual that may have had other issues, and that's why he was suddenly thrown out?
In the oral history interviews we conducted, we didn't speak about that. What I know is that he had lost the election in 2011 and decided to return to politics in 2019, but he was uninterested in rejoining the Liberal Party of Canada. From the oral history interviews, he makes it clear that he thinks that the party has moved in a direction away from its core principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, when you talk about, the quote, right, don't vote for the Greek, I think there were a lot of people who, A, were wanting to make sure that if there is a Greek who represents them, he's part of a winning or at least a prominent party. And B, this is just vague recollection on my part. There's unfortunately nothing on Google that I could dig up really easily. I do remember that there was controversy around him, and specifically his social values. So he had actually frustrated the progressive half of Canada by voting against a bunch of things like gay marriage. So he had come across as being more of a Harperite and no longer a liberal, so he was not wanted in the Liberal Party. So it wasn't so much that he was electing to stay out. He just wasn't part of the mainstream of the Liberal Party anymore. So there's no other way to explain he's extremely, extremely poor. Like, when you put up your first slide and you showed how poorly he polled in the writing, there's got to be something else to it.
For one, he ran as an independent candidate, and again, independent candidates do not have much success in Canada. But as you note, he was quite the presence from 1993 to 2011, and there were several issues with his voting record that led progressive voters away from what I'm gathering.
And so again, the only reason I'm raising it is, might we be theorizing around the broker model and the fraying of the broker model by potentially using not an ideal example? Like, might there be another Greek politician around whom we could sort of try and examine this?
This is the challenge, where we do have some Greek Canadian politicians, but we don't have many through which to theorize. And one of the things that came across in my discussions with John Cannis is that in the 1990s, they felt that there had been a sea change, that by having John elected, by having Eleni Bakopanos elected, they now had a seat at the table, at the decision-making table, is what he was saying, and that this was significant, that they had a facilitator in order to affect the type of change that, from his estimation, the Greek community was asking for.
Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting lecture. I would like to ask you, I know nothing about Cannis. Was Cannis related to any Greek politician?
He's related to an American politician from Cannis as well, but I don't think he's related to any Greek politicians. No, I'm not.
So he had no relations with Greek politics or with the Greek, let's say, political milieu?
There was some familiarity from his business and from his personal experience, from what I'm gathering. But in terms of his engagement with Greek politics, I don't think that he had been engaged with Greek politics, no.
So he was unknown. That's what I want to say, that he was completely unknown for Greek politics, for Greek politicians.
I think so.
Nobody knew him.
I think that this is part of the challenge and part of the frustration of Diaspora, is that we don't feel that these connections have been very strong between Greece and Canada for some time. There are moments when bridges are created and when conversations are cultivated, but these are few and far between. I think we're in a different moment now, and from my discussions with John Cannis, he thinks that he and Eleni Bakopanos and some of the other, Jim Karagenis and some of the other Greek Canadian politicians who were elected as Chrétien liberals are responsible for that.
Thank you. They didn't know Andreas Papandreou, for instance.
No.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. One question, is Cannis related to Biliris, one, in the States? And the second one is a statement, as someone who lived in Alberta for 45 years. And I was very active in the Greek community politics, within the community. I think it is best to say what you said, which is very interesting and correct. It's central Canada. Has nothing to do with Saskatchewan, Regina, or Edmonton. The Greek community is there. It's literally a Wild West.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot even elect somebody in a mayor's office, you know, in the city council. So I think somehow this research has to be placed within a central Canada framework.
It is exclusively focused on Greek Toronto at this point.
So we should say so. Again, as a Greek who spent all those years in the West, that there is this divide, which is something else that when Cannis came to visit in Alberta, it was his social voting that people did not like. So there are occasional connections, but I think central Canada, and then maybe there will not be enough Greeks to do a study in the West because the community is thinning out.
There are several communities. They're not as large as the communities in Toronto and Montreal, but they have institutions. They have their own, not only their associations, but they also have museums on the West Coast on Hellenism. We're learning a lot and building a lot of bridges with all of these organizations.
What have to do in relation to politicians, not culture.
When it comes to politics, I think John Cannis's claim is that we need to focus our attention towards specific ridings where Greek Canadians can yield an impact and try to support them in those ways. In Alberta, unfortunately, I don't think that there are many where, I think you're right, I don't think that they can yield an impact through the broker model. Yeah, or Regina, yeah. Okay.
If there are no more questions, we can continue the discussion over a glass of wine in the adjoining rooms. Let's thank Bill once again. Thank you.